Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the Carnegie Endowment. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is and an honor it is to welcome Jim Clapper to Carnegie and to sit alongside him on this stage. For half a century, as all of you know, from his service as a young Air Force intelligence officer in Vietnam to his service as Director of National Intelligence, Jim has truly been the consummate intelligence professional, as dedicated and skillful a public servant as I've ever known. What I can tell you is that it was always immensely reassuring to sit alongside him in another room with even less outside light than this one, in the White House Situation Room for many hours on many issues. Yes. Jim's, brings back memories, doesn't it? Our nostalgia is under control, probably. But Jim's judgment and integrity was admired by everyone in that room. He was always careful to distinguish between what we knew and what we thought, and always committed to calling things as he saw them, no matter how inconvenient to some of the other people sitting around the table. Jim has continued to offer wise perspective and honest judgment since leaving government, especially in his new book, Facts and Fears, Hard Truths from a Life in Intelligence. It's a terrific book, and Jim has kindly agreed to sign copies downstairs after the discussion. And with another holiday season fast approaching, I'd urge all of you to buy as many copies as you can carry.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I'll start the discussion with 3 or 4 brief questions and then open it up to all of you. But first, please join me in a warm welcome for Jim Clapper.
Thank you. Uh-oh.
So, Jim, let me just start with a broad question. I mean, as you write very elegantly in your book, the intelligence profession has changed enormously over the last half century. As you look ahead to the next decade from the point of view of the U.S. intelligence community, what do you think are the biggest challenges out there? What are we well prepared for today, and what do you think we're not as well prepared for?
Well, first, it's an honor to be on the stage here with somebody I regard as a personal hero and who is a stalwart when he was in government service, and particularly in those many hours we shared in the sit room. I think the biggest single driver of change in the intelligence community, looking back over 50 plus years that I've been in and around it, has been technology. That has changed things, both our own technology and the technology of adversaries. And I think that will be what drives change more than anything in the future. The area I have highlighted consistently since I left the government, where I don't think that the entire national security apparatus, and specifically the intelligence community, is paying enough attention to, and that is the profound national security implications of climate change. You can argue till the cows come home about, well, how much of it's man-made and all that, but this is going to have huge implications for the globe, not just the United States. And climate change is not something that respects nation-state boundaries or sovereignty. And that relatedly, of course, are changes in the environment and I think, pretty scary prospects for disease as a result of climate change. One little factoid is that the world's population is gravitating to megalopolises. I can't say that 3 times fast. Most of which are located in coastal areas. So if you just watch what's happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic and the melting of the ice caps, and the effect that's going to have on sea level, where an inch or 2 of an increase in sea level will have huge impacts on these major urban areas. And I just cite that as one vignette where I believe we don't pay enough attention. Another simple factoid is the condition of arable soil all over the globe. whereas the Earth's population is increasing, the arable soil we have is actually wearing out and is not being replaced at sufficiently rapid enough pace to sustain the projected population in the world. These things have, I won't drone on about this, but they have huge national security implications for us and for everyone else. So that's an area I concern. Now that is somewhat of a form of technology. I think another area I'd mention briefly because it has huge potential is artificial intelligence, which I think will be a big driver of intelligence, a change in the intelligence profession, an understanding of it, how to apply it. When I left after 50 plus years in intelligence, intelligence analysts still spending way too much time gathering, correlating, synthesizing information before they would get to actually analyzing it, that is, doing what only the human mind can deal with. And they still spend way too much time on things that can be automated. Artificial intelligence is a great example, though, of the two-edged sword nature of technology. It's like fire. Has good applications and bad. No less a character than Vladimir Putin has stated that whoever dominates artificial intelligence in the world will dominate the world. That may be an overstatement, but it's certainly recognition of the importance that he attaches to artificial intelligence, and I think the Russians collectively. The Chinese have mounted a very large and centrally orchestrated campaign to dominate artificial intelligence, and they're spending a lot of money on it. We're probably still ahead in that realm, but we are, we're in the, let 1,000 flowers bloom approach where it's kind of decentralized. So I've droned on long enough about that.
Well, how well organized do you think we are as a government, given the obvious competition with Russia, with China, with lots of others?
With respect to artificial intelligence?
Yeah,
well, we're not really. At least I'm not aware of any direction that's coming out of the White House or the OSTP office. It's not quite what it was during the administration you and I served in. And so our approach is, and maybe it's deliberate, I don't know, has been not to centralize. Now, the government elements involved in research on this, IARPA, DARPA, NSA, I think they do a good job of coordinating among themselves, but as far as I can tell, there's no overarching strategy or approach to artificial intelligence.
Another of the big challenges, as you write about in the book, that's produced by the revolution in technology is the struggle to find a balance between privacy and security as well, which the Snowden case brought into pretty sharp relief. Do you think we're any closer today to finding in our own society the right kind of balance?
I often found myself wishing for the halcyon days of the Cold War, when there were essentially two telecommunication systems. One dominated by the Soviet Union and their orb, and the other dominated in the West, essentially by the United States. But they were largely mutually exclusive. I was a young pup at NSA in those days at one point, and it was a rare occurrence if you ever saw reference to a US person in the Soviet-dominated telecommunication system. It just didn't happen very often. Well, now the advent of the internet, and now everybody is globally interconnected. So you have hundreds of millions of people conducting innocent people conducting billions of innocent transactions every day. And all mixed up among them are nefarious people, either nefarious nation states or nefarious individuals, non-nation state entities, who are operating in that very same ecosystem, all mixed up. So it's not a question of finding a needle in a haystack, it's a question of finding a few needles in thousands of haystacks and trying to be as discreet and surgical as we possibly can be, the intelligence community, I say we, gotta be careful here, to try to discern only the needles and not to in any way affect the haystack. And I think Jim Comey had a pretty good metaphor when he said, not only that, but we're expected to watch when a straw of hay is converting to a needle. So it is a profound technical challenge from a volume standpoint, if nothing else, to only pick out those bad needles among those millions and billions of haystacks. That's, maybe I'm stretching the metaphor here too much, but that to me is kind of the simple illustration of the magnitude of the problem. There are all kinds of mechanisms that have been built into the system where all three branches of the government are involved in oversighting that and to attempt to do both safety and security of the country and civil liberties and privacy of its citizens. And it can't be an either-or thing, it has to be both.
Some of the most fascinating passages in the book are about North Korea, Jim, and you write about your own direct conversations with the North Koreans, and it was an issue we wrestled with a lot in government. And I remember you expressed some unease in the last administration that we weren't engaging more directly at high levels with the North Koreans. And President Trump has already met once with Kim Jong-un. There are plans for a second summit meeting. And you've made the argument that the problem is not talking to each other, it's the risk of talking past each other. So if you were back in your old role and briefing in advance of another meeting with Kim Jong-un, how would you describe the North Korean calculus in looking at negotiations with the US over the nuclear and missile issue, North Korea's attitude toward China, its big neighbor? How would you describe things?
By way of background, I served in South Korea in the mid-'80s. I was Director of Intelligence for U.S. Forces Korea for 2 years. And I became kind of a student, an analyst of the Korean Peninsula and North Korea. And I guess, you take the boy out of Korea, but you can't take Korea out of the boy. And it was always on my professional bucket list. It'd be cool someday to go to North Korea. And I got to go on November 14 to retrieve 2 of our citizens that had been in hard labor conditions. I might comment that anything you've ever read about what a bizarre place North Korea is, it's all true. It's bizarre. So the first talking point that I was given by the White House to recite to the North Koreans when I showed up there was, you must denuclearize before we will negotiate with you. Well, I was there about 5 minutes, and I concluded that was a non-starter. They're not about to denuclearize. They understand, by the way, their weaknesses. They understand their economy is weak. They understand that they are at a profound disadvantage when they look south, from Pyongyang looking south, that they are confronting an overwhelming conventional military force in the form of the Republic of Korea, buttressed by the United States. So they view a nuclear capability as their ticket to survival. They went to school in Muammar Gaddafi. They brought that up with me. He negotiated away his weapons of mass destruction with the United States and didn't turn out so well for him. So they drew a lesson from that. Having said all that, the overwhelming impression when I was there, which blew me away, was the magnitude of the paranoia and the siege mentality that prevailed among the elite that I engaged with when I visited there. And so it occurred to me that, witness my talking point that I was supposed to recite, that both the United States and North Korea were stuck on our respective narratives. And that the only way those narratives could change, in my opinion, was if the bigger partner, meaning the United States, changed it. So I was a supporter, said so on CNN, of President Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore. I thought that was a good idea. I do think, though, that he didn't take advantage of the tremendous leverage he had just by virtue of agreeing to meet with Kim Jong-un. This is something the North Koreans have lusted for decades. The Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, and his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, have all wanted a face-to-face personal meeting across the table with the President of the United States. A huge thing for them. And that became very clear to me when I was there. So I supported that. I don't think he took advantage of it, though. And I wish, the question I wish he'd asked Kim Jong-un, and maybe he gets a do-over, he can ask then, what is it would take to make you feel sufficiently secure that you don't need nuclear weapons? It'd be very interesting to hear straight from the horse's mouth what the answer to that question is. Now, we might not like it, probably, withdraw all your troops or something. We've been there 69 years, so you might ask, well, how much longer are we going to be there? But anyway, it would have been really interesting, and it seems to me logical that if you're going to map out a negotiating strategy, it would be good to know what is it that your interlocutor wants. I don't think we actually know that. Just for fun, about 5 or 6 weeks ago on CNN, I said, maybe we need to rethink our approach to North Korea. A lot of people think about these issues are not real comfortable with the fact that India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, but the reality is they have them. And the reality is they've been responsible with them. North Korea, I believe, has lately been attempting to portray or demonstrate responsible behavior. We haven't had any nuclear tests recently. We haven't underground. We haven't any missile tests. They've toned down the rhetoric. They're getting along better with the South Koreans. They returned 55 sets of remains from the Korean War. They released 2 hostages, one of their favorite techniques for extracting leverage. And most importantly, in my view, great symbolism, which is important to the North Koreans, there was the absence or omission of any long-range missiles in the parade commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Korean Workers' Party. So the North Koreans, I believe, are attempting to portray responsible behavior. Now, why have they done that? Why have they moderated their behavior? Well, my view is there's nothing to do with the tweets. It has everything to do with the fact that I believe the North Koreans have achieved whatever it is they think they need, which we wouldn't measure the same way, but whatever it is they think they need for nuclear deterrence, which in the end is all about psychology. And so now they can come to the table not as a supplicant, which has always been the case in the past whenever we have negotiated with the North Koreans about nuclear weapons. So perhaps we need to rethink if they can demonstrate responsible behavior about denuclearization. I actually think the answer to that question actually lies in Seoul. For my money, President Moon is maybe the most astute president in the history of the Republic. He's managed his 2 portfolios very astutely, both in Pyongyang and in Washington. And I think if the South Koreans, the Republic of Korea, can persuade the North that they are not interested in invading or overturning the regime, which I don't believe they are, that might give the North Koreans sufficient security that they could get to the point where they don't need nuclear weapons. So I think the answer to that question, the question I pose rhetorically, lies in Seoul.
Jim, let me ask you a question about another easy challenge, which you also write about in the book, also connected to nuclear issues, which is Iran, where the Trump administration, has embarked on a strategy which is less connected to engagement and more connected to trying to build up pressure. In this instance, less multilaterally and more driven by the United States. Right. So talk a little bit about how you see this unfolding, its impact on Iran.
Well, I thought we made a mistake by withdrawing from what's called the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Yeah, it had its imperfections. What I would have preferred, if I were king, which I obviously not, would be to use that agreement as a basis for getting after some of this other bad behavior that nobody likes on the part of the Iranians. Their nefarious activities in the region, support the Hezbollah and the Houthis, et cetera, et cetera. Rather than backing out of this agreement, and in the interest of, I guess, what I've heard the president say, he wants a, quote, better deal. But somehow we're going to extract a better deal, which I guess means reforming all of Iran's bad behavior, meaning missiles, activity in the theater, and their nuclear activity, but do it with a whole lot less leverage than we were able to bring to bear, thanks to great diplomacy, by bring together an international coalition of countries who agreed to enforce sanctions against Iran. A lot of those countries now don't want to help us, like China, like India, to name two, and plus the other. And by the way, it wasn't a bilateral agreement between us and Iran. There were 5 other countries involved. So to me, it just seemed like we gave away leverage that we could have exerted. And the other thing about it is, to me at least, what we did plays to the hardliner narrative in Iran. What I was seeing happening, and what I see now from open source, is I believe there's a kind of a soft revolution underfoot in Iran, mostly fomented by young people who are frustrated by the corruption of the banking system, the financial system, and the corruption of the regime, which I think is on its beginning of the end. But what we did by withdrawing from the JCPOA is, I think, playing to the hardliners.
Well, last question for me, and then I'll open it up to all of you. But last question for me is on Russia, another easy subject. And so and I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunities for a follow-up too.
Sure.
But one of the last and thorniest issues that you grappled with as Director of National Intelligence was Russia's meddling in the 2016 elections. What do you think we got right at the end of the last administration in dealing with those issues, and what did we get wrong?
Well, I thought, we recognized recognized the issue. I will tell you that in my 50+ years of intel, I've seen a lot of bad stuff, but nothing that disturbed me as much as what I saw the Russians do. And I should point out that all truth about this subject didn't reveal itself in one day. So it was a gradual thing that as we saw collected more, understood better and better what the magnitude of what the Russians were doing. And there's a long history of the Russians interfering in elections, theirs and other people's. And we have records going back to the 50s and 60s where the Russians did things to try to influence the outcome of elections. But never on a scale, magnitude, and multi-dimensional basis as they did in the election in 2016. And it was really, really disturbing to me. So an FAQ I get is frequently asked question, why didn't the Obama administration do more earlier, yada, yada. And you can do the coulda, woulda, shouldas all day long. I think there were a couple factors, and Bill will have insight on this himself. But as I saw it, it appeared to me that first, there was a reluctance to make a big thing about what the Russians were doing, which would simply serve to amplify or magnify it even more. Then I think a bigger factor in the mind of President Obama, and I'm surmising here, is that he didn't want to be seen as putting his hand on the scale of in favor of one candidate to the disfavor of the other, against a backdrop of where candidate Trump was already alleging that the election would be rigged, particularly if he didn't win it. So all those factors kind of played into that. We had, speaking of discussions and endless discussions and meetings about what to do and when to do it and all that. Finally, it grew to the point where we had to say something. So Jay Johnson, Secretary of Homeland Security, and I went out with a public release on the 7th of October, which was, I thought, pretty forthcoming about what the Russians were doing and the fact that this was being directed at the highest levels of the Russian government, meaning one guy. Unfortunately, our sense of timing wasn't so good because that was the very same day that the Access Hollywood tapes came out, which kind of emasculated our message, as well as the dump of John Podesta's emails. So our message that we put out, which we intended to try to alert the electorate, and this was a month before the election, kind of got buried. I was a big supporter of the sanctions that we did impose, closing the 2 Dachas. The one in Maryland particularly is just a large intelligence collection operation. And PNGing 35 Russian operatives here in the United States. and imposing sanctions on certain individuals, the Russians. My problem with that, frankly, was a little late. That was done on the 29th of December. I wish it had been done before the election. And the other thing is, even with that round of sanctions, which I certainly supported, that I had anticipated that would just be phase one. And we were going to pass off all this information about what the Russians are doing to the oncoming administration. I kind of assumed or hoped that there would be a phase two sanctions, et cetera. This, to me, what the Russians did, a profound threat, because what they are bent on is undermining our fundamental system. And they had messages for everybody. And of course, which they, using the tool, the enabler of social media, and the magnitude of what they did. To get some insight into the fidelity of what the information we had is read the two indictments that the Mueller investigation put out. One last July, and I think the other one in February, the last one, which indicted the 12 GRU members. Pretty specific, pretty specific. That to me is a real threat, poses all kinds of challenges for the intelligence community, how to handle this. And one of the great challenges for, I think, this country, apart from technical, bureaucratic, administrative things we can do to secure what I would call our voting apparatus, is how do you get people not to accept everything they see, read, or hear on the internet? That's a harder challenge. It really is.
Thanks, Jim. I promise not to monopolize the conversation, so let me open it up to all of you. If you just raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and then please identify yourself, be brief, and remember to end with a question mark. Yes, sir. It's right behind you.
Voice of America Russian Service. You started your time, Voice of America Russian Service. You started your time as a chief of national intelligence with, in the year when 11 Russian agents were arrested and then expelled, and you ended your time when 35 diplomats/agents were expelled. What is your opinion? What's scale and depth of Russian intelligence operations in the United States now, in this very moment? And it's a bit amateurish, but how many you calculate them, like tens, thousands?
I obviously don't know the.
Thank you.
I don't know the answer to that question anymore, happily, since I haven't had access to classified information. I'm sorry? Well, the Russians have the most aggressive intelligence operation in the United States and have had for some time. And so the way I looked at it is any Russian that was connected with the embassy here had at least a secondary intelligence collection mission. That's the way I look at it. So I have no doubt that the Russians, since I left, are still as aggressive as they always have been in planning people in this country by some means under non-official cover, and are aggressively collecting intelligence wherever they can.
Thanks.
It's in their DNA.
Yes, sir. Mike's right behind you, just to your right. There you go.
Hi, my name is Ray McGovern. I'm part of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Thanks for this book. It's very, very interesting. I'd like to refer to the Russian problem, but first, there's an analogy that I see here. You were in charge of imagery analysis before Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
You confessed to having been shocked that no weapons of mass destruction were found. And then, to your credit, you admit, as you say here,
Oh, this is bad.
that the
Really
blame
bad.
is due to intelligence officers, including me, who were so eager to help the administration make war in Iraq, that we found what wasn't really there. Okay, now fast forward to this time 2 years ago. Your superiors were hell-bent on finding ways to blame Trump's victory on the Russians. Do you think that your efforts were guilty of the same sin here? Do you think that you found a lot of things that weren't really there? Because that's what our conclusion is, especially from the technical end.
Yeah.
There was no hacking on the DNC. It was a leak, and you know that if you've talked to NSA.
Well, I have talked to NSA a lot, and I also know what we briefed to then President-elect Trump on the 6th of January. And in my mind, I spent a lot of time in the SIGINT business, the forensic evidence was overwhelming about what the Russians had done. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever. The intelligence community assessment that we rendered that day that was tasked to us by President Obama in early December made no call whatsoever on to what extent the Russians influenced the outcome of the election. The administration, the team then, the President-elect's team, wanted to say that we said that the Russian interference had no impact whatsoever on the election. And I attempted, we all did, to try to correct that misapprehension as they were writing a press release before we left the room. However, as a private citizen, understanding the magnitude of what the Russians did and the number of citizens in our country they reached and the different mechanisms by which they reached it, to me it stretches credulity to think that they didn't have profound impact on the outcome of the election.
Well, that's what the New York Times says. And let me just say this, that we have two former technical directors from NSA in our movement here, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We also have forensics, okay? Now, the president himself, your president, President Obama, said 2 days before he left town, the conclusions of the intelligence community, this is 10 days after you briefed him, with respect to how WikiLeaks got the DNC emails, are inconclusive, end quote. Now, why would he say that if you had said it was conclusive?
I don't know I can't explain what he said or why, but I will tell you that we are pretty sure we know or knew at the time how WikiLeaks got those emails. I'm not going to go into the technical details here about why we believe that.
We are too.
It was
a leak onto a thumb drive, got into Julian Assange. Really simple. If you knew it and the NSA has that information, you have a duty. You have a duty to confess to that, as well as
confess to what?
Confess to the fact that you've been distorting the evidence.
I don't confess to
the
that.
intelligence community assessment was without evidence.
Hey, Ray.
I do
Ray,
not
thanks.
confess to that.
Yeah, I don't want us to.
I just simply don't agree with your conclusion.
I appreciate your question, but I didn't want this to look like Jim Acosta in the White House grabbing microphones away. So thank you for the question, though. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Ali Gerard, and I'm with Amnesty International. We're a global human rights movement with 7 million members. We've been campaigning on behalf of Edward Snowden for many years. We think he's a hero, and we think his courage sparked a global debate about mass surveillance that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in March 2013, you told the US Congress that the NSA may have unwittingly spied on the American people. But just a few months later, Edward Snowden revealed that that was not true. So at Amnesty International, we're shocked that this many years after 9/11, there hasn't been any prosecutions for torture or unlawful drone strikes, but Edward Snowden is the one who's facing time behind bars. So I want to know from you, after those revelations came out that you probably committed perjury and lied to the US Congress and American people, how on earth did you keep your job, sir?
So, first of all, I could almost understand what and accept what Edward Snowden did if his only concern and all he exposed was so-called domestic surveillance. However, he exposed so much else that had absolutely nothing to do with domestic surveillance, seriously damaging our foreign intelligence collection capabilities. And if you're a taxpayer in this country and looking at the crowd, and I think most of you are, you're going to be paying for recovery from the damage he has done to our foreign intelligence capabilities for years. I can give you specific examples, but I won't prolong the conversation. With respect to the infamous exchange I had with Senator Wyden in March of 2013, this was at the end of a worldwide threat hearing before the Senate Intelligence Committee. And Senator Wyden asked a question, and if you go look at the YouTube video, you won't see the meandering preamble in which he uses the phrase dossiers, which are now famous for a different reason. So the fact is, the honest answer to your allegation is, I made a big mistake, but I did not lie. And the reason is, I simply didn't think about what Senator Wyden was asking about. What Senator Wyden was asking about in his meandering question was, of course, the limited metadata business records telephony storage program maintained by NSA. This was directly put in place by previous administration as a direct result of 9/11, where you have a foreign communicant who's plotting a terrorist attack, potentially talking to somebody in the United States. So NSA had this limited database that they maintained, which simply had the to number, the from number, and the length of the call, no content. I didn't think of that. This was governed by Section 215 of the Patriot Act. I didn't even think about that. It wasn't the subject of hearing, and I just made a mistake. What I thought about was Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which governs collection on non-US persons overseas. And so, of course, for the aforementioned reasons I explained about the changes in technology, that yes, without doing so, without intending to, there could be US persons' data intercepted under the provisions of Section 702. That's what I was thinking about. That's not what Senator Wyden was asking about. Even if I had been on the same page with Senator Wyden, I'd have still been in a bad place, because at the time that program was classified. And I've been trotting up the hill for 20 or 25 years. I've answered probably hundreds, maybe thousands of questions in either open or closed sessions, either orally and in writing. And I've always tried to be straight and truthful about it. But gee, just for a change of pace, I think I'll lie on this one question and do it on live television in front of one of my oversight committees. No, not really. So yeah, I made a mistake, and I have acknowledged it, and I explain it in the book. But I didn't lie. The larger issue, the big takeaway, big lesson of Edward Snowden is, yes, the US intelligence community needs to be more transparent. There's no question about it. For as long as I've been in intelligence, there has always been an aura of suspicion and mystery about everything and anything the intelligence community does. That's just inherent, because if the intelligence community were completely 100% transparent, we wouldn't have an intelligence community. We wouldn't be collecting any intelligence. So you always have that issue of protecting, valuable secrets, sources and methods and tradecraft and techniques, but at the same time trying to be as open and public about what the intelligence community does. So I, as a result of that, set about declassifying a lot of documents, mainly pertaining to the operation of a unique thing, the only unique in the world, the only United States operates, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which passes judgment on collection activities that could affect or impact US persons. So there is this dilemma that we alluded to before about trying to keep the nation safe and secure, and protecting civil liberties and privacy. And the overall lesson out of all that was, should have been more transparent. I think had the program in question been explained at the time, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, probably could have got legislation big enough to drive a truck through to allow it. What was done to replace Section 215 of the Patriot Act was the USA Freedom Act, which was, I think, passed in 2015. So the only real change there was, instead of NSA having access to about 30% of all landline phone calls in the United States, which was the case under the 215 program, now they have access to probably 75 or 80%, except that the difference is that the metadata in question is held by the providers, the commercial providers, not by NSA.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, sir. Right, the gentleman in the back there. Yeah, just behind.
Greg Thielman, a board member of the Arms Control Association. General Clapper, I have more of a process question because I don't disagree with your conclusions about Russian meddling. What I'm still curious about, even after reading your book, is why the judgment was 3 intelligence agencies rather than a national intelligence assessment or something that would include, for example, INR, where I used to work.
We made a deliberate decision because of the sensitivity of the data and those arms of the intelligence community that have a counterintelligence mission, that we decided to limit it because we only had a month. So it wasn't treated as a full-up national intelligence estimate where everybody all 16 components of the intelligence community would pass judgment on it. That was a deliberate decision that we made, and I agreed with. You can fault that, but that was the rationale.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Yurter Özcan. I'm the U.S. representative for CHP, the main opposition party in Turkey. Just looking at the past few years, the rapprochement between Erdogan and Putin, in your official capacity, did you have a feeling that even though Turkey is a NATO partner, Erdogan's government has acted, as a proper partner in terms of intelligence sharing? Because when we look at the role that Erdogan has played, especially in Syria, helping jihadists there against Assad, or helping Iran evade sanctions, the U.S. sanctions by almost $40 billion, which, as you know, was a court case in New York. There's still pending in U.S. Treasury. I mean, did you have a feeling that Erdogan's government has acted as a proper NATO partner when it comes to intelligence work with the U.S.? Thank you.
Question is just about whether Erdogan's Turkey has acted as an effective, proper intelligence partner for the United States over the last couple of years.
Well, I think over time, looking back, it's varied depending on who was in charge of their intelligence apparatus. It's kind of gone up and down. I don't know. That can make it would appear they're cooperating right now, particularly with respect to the journalists, but it hasn't always been thus, depending on the political situation in Turkey. But over history, Turkey has, for example, in the heyday of the Cold War, hosted extensive SIGINT collection by the United States on their soil, and they allowed reconnaissance missions to stage in and out of Turkey. So historically, they've been cooperative, but it varies according to, the current situation.
Thanks. Yes, ma'am. Microphone's on its way.
Thank you, reporter from Voice America. I have a question about China. We talk about North Korea, Iran, and Russia. So given China's rising tension with the United States, so what is the biggest threat China could pose to the United States from the intelligence point of view? Thank you.
China could what?
The biggest threat that China could pose to the United States from the intelligence point.
Well, I think broader than intelligence is, I think long-term, I think short-term our greatest threat is Russia, particularly as long as Vladimir Putin is in office, because of, I think, what I view as his personal animus towards the United States and all we stand for. But I think long-term, our greatest threat is China. A number of reasons for that. One is just they're going to overtake us as the world's largest economy. 1/3 of the world's billionaires are in China. They were embarked on a very aggressive military modernization program, which is keyed exactly to what they view as our strengths. So C4I, space, aggressive counter space program, which is done in recognition of our dependence on space. Then the other element of China is their scientific and technical prowess. and how they've organized themselves to acquire technology, either through theft or on their own. And this is all centrally controlled, and you can read it in their 5-year plan, and the kinds of technologies they're after. So I think now, some would argue that the fact that our two economies, unlike the case with Russia, our two economies are inextricably bound. That serves to perhaps temper or moderate China's behavior. I mean, we could do a lot of bad things to each other economically if we wanted to. But I think China's growing power, which was going to transcend, on a long-term basis, is going to transcend Russia.
Thanks, Jim. I think we have time for just a couple more questions, but sir.
Hello, sir. My name is Ben, and I wanted to point out I'm a former analyst at the NSA, including during your tenure. And one of the things that has been so frustrating for me during my time there and beyond is just the complete lack of understanding that some people have about how complicated the signals intelligence system is.
Yeah.
And no, really, and it frustrates me so much because protecting the privacy and identity of Americans is so sacrosanct and built into the culture of NSA right now. And the systems are so complicated. If people understood how difficult it would be to violate that, the amount of audits internally at the analyst level that are going on, and how difficult it is to even do proper work against terrorists.
Yeah, let me just jump in here, because one factoid I recall from when I was serving as DNI was the hundreds of compliance officers that NSA has who are there only to ensure compliance with all of the many, many technical rules and regulations and demands to, yes, glean the intelligence, but do everything possible to avoid compromising civil liberties and privacy.
But I do have a question. The other thing I was going to say is how frustrating it is that given all these controls and the respect for the Constitution and trying to protect Americans, that our adversaries don't have that, right? It's not an even playing field. Russia is not building in those protections. You know, Turkey is not building in those protections. That's why Snowden is so frustrating for me. Sorry, when I hear that, it just makes my blood boil, because people do not understand how much information he gave to our adversaries and how hurtful that was to a mission that is completely legitimate to protect us. So my question to you is, thank you for this, sorry for the passion, but my question is, the thing that I've been most frustrated about lately is that we, I guess this meme has been trending, that we seem to be living in a post-truth society where people no longer seem to believe facts. They seem to believe only what they want. I guess, do you have any thoughts on this? Is there any hope that we're going to get beyond this? Or are we now living in a new reality where people just believe the version that they want?
I think in my mind, you've raised maybe the most important question that's been raised here this afternoon. And that is, overarching over everything else is the assault, and Mike Hayden has been, I think, very articulate about this, the assault on truth. And those endeavors who depend on truth or empirical fact for their perpetuation. So I'm thinking of things like science, academics, law enforcement, the IC, journalism, who ideally are supposed to depend on empirical fact and truth. And those endeavors are all under assault, not just in this country, but elsewhere. That is fundamentally dangerous to a democracy, this one or any other. And it's something we all ought to be very concerned about how do we get back to, fact, truth, empirical data.
Great, this is going to have to be the last question. Yes, sir.
I didn't understand. I didn't hear that.
Last question, if I can correct me if I got it wrong, was since about 2015, if you look at the challenge posed by China and you look at the number of breaches that have occurred, what percentage would you ascribe to the Chinese government as opposed to rogue actors and individuals? Is that right?
I don't know. That's a take-home question. I don't really have any, and I probably if I knew the answer, I couldn't recite it. So I'm sorry.
Thanks. Well, one of the chores as a moderator that I hate most is having to bring fascinating conversations to a close, but I need to do that now because Jim has very kindly agreed to go downstairs and sign books, and so I'd urge all of you to take advantage of that opportunity. But first, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening, and especially to thank Jim Clapper, who I think has reminded us of why we were so fortunate for so many years as a country to have his public service. So Jim, thank you very much again.
Thanks very much.